Hello guys, and welcome to the Expensive Coins History channel. What if I told you that a coin you might have held in your hand without a second thought could quietly be worth tens of thousands of dollars today? Not gold, not silver, just a simple Canadian penny. The kind that once slipped between couch cushions, sat forgotten in jars, or passed casually from one hand to another. But hidden within that ordinary appearance is a story that very few people know. A story of timing, rarity, and a moment in history that transformed something common into something extraordinary. Today, we begin a journey into one of those stories. And by the end of it, you might never look at a 1-cent coin the same way again. Because the first coin we're about to explore, the 1981 Canadian 1 cent, is not just a piece of copper. It's a silent witness to a turning point in Canada's economic and minting history. And for a select few collectors, it has become a treasure worth up to $88,000. Now imagine that for a moment, a coin most people would ignore, valued higher than many cars, even homes in some places. But to understand why, we have to go back in time. The year was 1981. Canada, like much of the world, was navigating a period of economic uncertainty. Inflation had been rising through the late 1970s, and governments were beginning to rethink the cost of producing everyday currency. The humble penny, once made primarily of bronze, was becoming increasingly expensive to manufacture. And this is where things begin to get interesting. You see, 1981 wasn't just another routine year for the Canadian Mint. It was a transitional moment. Subtle changes were being considered. Experiments were underway. And while millions of pennies were struck that year, not all of them were exactly the same. The average person. Every 1981 penny looks identical. The familiar image of Queen Elizabeth II on one side, the iconic maple leaves on the other. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable. But collectors, they don't see coins the way most people do. They look closer. They study the smallest details, the weight, the composition, the strike quality, even microscopic variations that would escape an untrained eye. And in 1981, those small details started to matter more than ever. The portrait of Queen Elizabeth II used on the coin was designed by Arnold Machin, a name that might not mean much at first, but his work defined an entire era of coinage across multiple countries. His depiction of the Queen is elegant, mature, and composed, a reflection of stability during uncertain times. On the reverse side, the two maple leaves, simple yet deeply symbolic, represent Canada's identity, strength, resilience, and unity. It's a design that had been in use for decades, and by 1981, it had become instantly recognizable. But beneath that familiar design, something subtle was happening. The Royal Canadian Mint was beginning to explore changes in metal composition due to rising costs. While most 1981 pennies were still struck in bronze, there were variations in how these coins were produced. Differences in planchets, slight inconsistencies in weight, and most importantly, differences in quality control. And this is where collectors start to lean in closer. Because not every coin that leaves a mint is perfect. In fact, the coins that aren't perfect are often the ones that become the most valuable. In 1981, a small number of pennies were struck under unusual conditions. Some had sharper details, others had slight anomalies that set them apart. And then there were those rare examples, coins that were preserved in near-perfect condition, untouched by circulation, retaining their original luster as if they had just been minted yesterday. These are the coins that collectors dream about, because condition is everything. That a 1981 penny that has been worn down through years of use might be worth exactly 1 cent. But the same coin, preserved in pristine condition, with no scratches, no discoloration, and full original shine, becomes something entirely different. It becomes rare, and rarity is where value begins. But even among well-preserved coins, there are levels. The grading system used by collectors can elevate a coin from being merely desirable to being truly exceptional. And in the case of the 1981 Canadian penny, a handful of coins have reached those exceptional levels. These are coins that have been graded at the very top of the scale. Coins that show no visible flaws even under magnification. Coins that have survived decades without losing their original brilliance. Now here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. Because rarity alone isn't enough. There has to be demand. And over the years, the demand for high-grade Canadian pennies, especially from transitional periods like the early 1980s, has steadily increased. Collectors who once overlooked these coins are now realizing their significance. Investors are beginning to see them not just as collectibles, but as assets. And as demand rises, so does value. But let me share something that most people don't realize. Some of these valuable 1981 pennies didn't come from special collections or auctions. They came from ordinary places. Old jars, forgotten drawers, inherited coin boxes that hadn't been opened in years. People who had no idea what they were holding suddenly found themselves in possession of something extraordinary. And that's part of what makes this so compelling, because it means that even today, there are still undiscovered coins out there, still waiting, still hidden in plain sight. Now, let's talk about one of the most intriguing aspects of the 1981 penny, the subtle variations that separate the ordinary from the exceptional. Collectors often examine the strike quality, how clearly the design elements appear on the coin. A stronger strike means sharper details, more defined edges, a more visually appealing coin. Then there's the luster, that original shine that reflects light in a way that only freshly minted coins can. Over time, this luster fades as coins are handled and exposed to the environment. But in rare cases, it remains intact. And finally, there's the surface preservation. Even the smallest scratch can reduce a coin's grade. But a coin that remains flawless becomes incredibly rare. Now imagine a coin that combines all of these qualities: a 1981 penny with a strong strike, full original luster, and a perfectly preserved surface. That's not just a coin. That's a collector's prize. And when such a coin appears at auction, it doesn't go unnoticed. Bidders compete. Prices climb. And what once seemed insignificant becomes the center of intense interest. But the story doesn't end there, because over time, the number of these high-grade coins doesn't increase. If anything, it decreases. Coins are lost, damaged, or simply disappear into private collections, which means that the remaining examples become even more valuable. Scarcity intensifies demand, and demand drives price. Now think about this for a moment. How many people, back in 1981, set aside a penny thinking it would one day be worth thousands of dollars? Very few. And that's why these coins are so rare today. They weren't meant to be saved. They were meant to be spent, which makes every surviving high-grade example a small miracle of preservation. And that brings us to the moment you've been waiting for. After decades of obscurity, after years of being overlooked, after quietly sitting in collections or hidden away in forgotten places, the true value of the 1981 Canadian 1-cent coin has finally been recognized. And when one of these exceptional coins reached the market in pristine, near-perfect condition, it achieved a staggering value of $88,000. Yes, for a single penny. Let that sink in. A coin that once held almost no purchasing power now commands a price that few would ever expect. And the most fascinating part, there could still be more out there, still waiting to be discovered, still unnoticed, still underestimated. The next time you come across an old coin, especially one from a year like 1981, don't dismiss it too quickly, because sometimes the smallest things carry the greatest stories. And sometimes those stories are worth far more than anyone ever imagined. Now, if you're ready, we can continue this journey into the second coin, a piece from 1968 with an even more surprising story and an even higher value. There's something fascinating about looking back at a coin from a time when the world itself felt very different, not just economically, but culturally, socially, even emotionally. And that's exactly where our journey takes us now, because the second coin in this story, the 1968 Canadian 1-cent, is not just older than the last one we explored. It comes from a period of transformation, a time when traditions were being questioned, systems were evolving, and even something as simple as a penny was quietly caught in the middle of change. Now imagine holding a coin that was minted more than half a century ago. Think about the hands it may have passed through, the everyday moments it may have witnessed, purchases, conversations, decisions, small fragments of life that are long gone now, yet somehow preserved through this tiny piece of metal that alone gives it meaning. But as you're about to discover, this coin carries far more than just it carries rarity. It carries mystery. And for those who truly understand it, it carries extraordinary value. Let's go back to 1968. This was a year that stood at the crossroads of old and new. Canada, like many countries, was adapting to a rapidly changing global environment. Technological progress was accelerating. Economies were shifting. And the Royal Canadian Mint was once again faced with a familiar challenge. Balancing tradition with practicality. By 1968, coin production had already begun to evolve. There were growing considerations about metal usage, efficiency, and long-term sustainability. While the penny still appeared unchanged on the surface, deeper decisions were being made behind the scenes. And just like in 1981, those decisions would leave subtle clues that only careful observers would notice. The design of the 1968 penny remained faithful to tradition. On one side, the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, still based on the earlier youthful depiction that had been introduced in the 1950s. This version of the Queen carries a different tone compared to later portraits, one that reflects a younger monarchy, still early in its long reign. There's a sense of history frozen in that image. A reminder of a time when the world saw her differently, and perhaps saw itself differently too. On the reverse, the maple leaves once again take their place. Familiar, steady, unchanged. It's almost comforting the way this design persisted through decades of change. A symbol that remained constant even as everything else evolved. But here's where the story begins to shift. Because 1968 was not just another production year. It was a year where small variations, almost invisible to most people, began to define the difference between ordinary and extraordinary. You see, not all 1968 pennies were created equal. Some were struck with slightly different characteristics. Variations in metal composition, subtle differences in finish, and in rare cases, anomalies that set certain coins apart from the rest. At the time, none of this seemed important. Coins were made to be used, to circulate, to serve a purpose, and then disappear into the flow of everyday life. No one was thinking about collectors. No one was imagining that decades later, these same coins would be examined under magnification, studied, graded, and pursued with intense interest. But that's exactly what happened, because over time, collectors began to notice. They began to see patterns, differences, unique traits that didn't match the standard expectations. And once those differences were identified, everything changed. The 1968 penny slowly transitioned from being just another coin into something much more intriguing. Now, let's talk about condition again, because just like with the 1981 coin, it plays a critical role here. But with older coins like the 1968 penny, condition becomes even more significant. Why? Because the older a coin is, the harder it is to find in pristine condition. Think about it. A coin minted in 1968 has had decades to be used, handled, scratched, worn down, and exposed to the elements. Every year that passes reduces the number of well-preserved examples, which means that when a coin from that era survives in near-perfect condition, it becomes incredibly rare, and rarity, once again, is where value begins to rise. But there's something else about the 1968 penny that makes it particularly compelling. That it's the idea of overlooked significance. For many years, these coins were not seen as special. They were common, ordinary, easily ignored. And that's exactly why so few were preserved carefully. Collectors tend to focus on coins that are already recognized as valuable. But the true treasures are often the ones that go unnoticed, the ones that slip through the cracks, the ones that no one thinks to save. And in the case of the 1968 Canadian penny, that's precisely what happened. For decades, these coins circulated without much attention. They were spent, exchanged, and forgotten. Only a small number were set aside, and even fewer were kept in exceptional condition. Then, slowly, the realization began to spread. Collectors started to revisit older coins with fresh eyes. They began to understand that value isn't always obvious at first. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it takes patience. And sometimes it takes a shift in perspective. As more collectors entered the market, demand began to grow. People weren't just looking for gold or silver anymore. They were looking for rarity, for uniqueness, for coins that told a story. And the 1968 penny, quietly, started to gain attention. Now imagine being one of the first people to recognize its potential. Imagine holding onto a coin that others overlooked, only to see it rise in value years later. That's the kind of moment collectors live for. That moment when insight turns into opportunity. But here's where things become even more interesting. Because not every 1968 penny is valuable. In fact, most of them are still worth very little. The difference lies in the details, the exact composition, the quality of the strike, the level of preservation, and in some cases, specific variations that are incredibly rare. These are the coins that stand out. These are the coins that collectors compete for. And just like before, when one of these exceptional coins appears on the market, it creates a ripple effect. Interest grows, bidding intensifies, and the value climbs. But what makes this story even more powerful is the element of time. Because the longer a coin exists, the more history it accumulates, the more stories it holds, and the more meaningful it becomes. That a 1968 penny isn't just rare because of its condition or its variations, that it's rare because it has survived through decades of change, through countless moments, through a world that has moved on in ways no one could have predicted. And yet, here it is, still here, still carrying its story, and now, finally being recognized for what it truly is. Which brings us to the moment of revelation. After years of quiet existence, after being overlooked by generations, after slowly gaining recognition among those who understand its significance, one of these rare, high-grade 1968 Canadian pennies reached a value that few would have believed possible. A value that transforms it from a simple coin into something extraordinary. That value is $109,000 for a single penny. A coin that once represented the smallest unit of currency, now commanding a price that reflects its rarity, its history, and its journey through time. And just like with the 1981 coin, the most incredible part is this: there may still be more out there, still hidden, still waiting, still unnoticed, which means that somewhere, perhaps in a drawer, a box, or a collection that hasn't been examined in years, another one of these coins could be sitting quietly, completely unaware of its true worth. And that's what makes this world so fascinating. Because it's not just about coins, that it's about discovery, it's about seeing value where others don't, that it's about understanding that even the smallest objects can carry the greatest significance. So the next time you come across an old penny, take a closer look, because history has a way of hiding in plain sight, and sometimes it only reveals itself to those who are willing to see it.